In 1923, on a small farm outside of Intercourse, Pennsylvania, in the heart of Lancaster County, an Amish farmer, named no different from 1,000 others before him, walked out into his kitchen garden at dusk and did something so simple, so cheap, and so devastatingly effective against slugs that the chemical industry, which would not fully arrive in American agriculture for another 2 decades, would eventually spend millions of dollars making sure you never thought to try it. What you are about to hear is not a gardening tip. It is a piece of American agricultural history that got buried under a century of product launches, marketing budgets, and government policy that quietly redefined what a real solution looks like. And at the center of this story is a question that is going to stay with you until the very end of this video. Why does a method that costs absolutely nothing and has worked without interruption for over 100 years remain almost completely unknown to the average American gardener in 2025? Stay with that question, because the answer is going to tell you something uncomfortable about the system you have been trusting with your food. Picture a Lancaster County morning in the early 1920s. The air smells like wet soil and wood smoke. A horse pulls a cultivator through a field of winter squash. The barn doors are open, and inside you can hear the low movement of cattle. An older Amish man, maybe 60 years old, is walking the perimeter of his kitchen garden before the sun gets too high. He is not looking at the plants. He is looking at the ground. Specifically, he is looking at the trails, the silver, glistening mucus trails that slugs leave behind on the soil surface when they have been feeding at night. He kneels, touches the earth with 2 fingers, and nods. He knows exactly what to do, because his father knew, and his father's father knew before him. And what he does costs him nothing, requires no container from a store, no label, no directions. It is so embedded in the ordinary rhythms of that farm that it does not even have a name. It is just what you do. That is what this video is about, not the tip, the loss. Because here is what the historical record shows, documented by researchers like Donald Craybill of Elizabethtown College, who spent decades studying Amish agricultural and community practices in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Amish farming communities did not adopt the chemical solutions that arrived in American agriculture after World War II, not because they were behind the times, because they saw no reason to replace what was already working. And what was working in garden after garden, across Holmes County in Ohio, across LaGrange County in Indiana, and across Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, was a suite of traditional pest management practices that had been refined over generations, and that cost, in most cases, nothing at all. Slugs were not a new problem in 1923. They had been destroying garden crops since the first European settlers broke ground in Pennsylvania soil. The Amish, who began settling in Lancaster County as early as the 1720s, had 200 years to figure out what actually worked. And what they figured out was not complicated. It was physical, biological, and ruthlessly effective. But to understand why it matters, you need to understand what it was competing against and when that competition arrived. If you have a garden, if you are tired of watching slugs chew through your lettuce and your hostas and your young bean seedlings, drop the number 47 inches the comments right now, or better yet, tell us the state you are gardening in. Let's see how many of us are out here, because I have a feeling this channel reaches further than any algorithm expects. The chemical industry did not invent the slug problem. It invented the idea that the slug problem required a purchased solution, and that idea did not arrive overnight. It arrived through a decades-long process that began in the laboratories of the post-World War II boom, when the same industrial infrastructure that had manufactured chemical weapons and explosives for the war effort needed a new market. Ammonium nitrate, which had been produced in enormous quantities as an explosive precursor, was rebranded almost overnight as agricultural fertilizer. And the same organophosphate chemistry that had been developed as nerve agents found new applications as pesticides. This is not speculation. This is documented industrial history. The shift from wartime chemical production to peacetime agricultural chemistry is one of the most consequential pivots in American economic history, and it happened between approximately 1945 and 1955, with a speed that left most American farmers no time to ask whether what was being sold to them was actually better than what they already had. And here is what the industry spent decades hoping you would never figure out. What American farmers had before that chemical wave arrived was, in many cases, more effective for the home garden than anything that came after. Let's talk about what the Amish were actually doing with slugs in 1923, because the mechanism matters. Slugs are, from a biological standpoint, extraordinarily simple creatures to manipulate if you understand their vulnerabilities. They breathe through a structure called a pneumostome, a single respiratory opening on the side of their body, and they move through muscular contraction, lubricated by mucus, which they produce at an enormous metabolic cost. That mucus is approximately 90% water, which means that anything that draws moisture away from the slug's body surface disrupts its locomotion, its respiration, and ultimately its survival. This is pure biology, unchanged since 1923, unchanged since 1723. The slug does not know what decade it is. Its body works the same way it always has. The Amish knew this not in scientific language, obviously, but in practical, observational terms accumulated over generations. They knew that certain textures and certain substances made it difficult or impossible for slugs to cross a barrier. They knew that slugs fed at night and retreated by day. They knew that slugs preferred moisture and hid beneath boards, stones, and thick mulch. And they used that knowledge to construct what we would now call an integrated trap and barrier system, using materials that existed on every farm in Lancaster County for free, in abundance, all year round. The primary material in the Amish slug method of this era was wood ash. Specifically, the dry, fine ash collected from the wood stove or fireplace that every Amish household ran as a matter of daily life. Wood ash is alkaline. Its pH runs between 9 and 11 depending on the wood source, and when it is dry, it creates a surface that is physically hostile to the slug's mucous membrane. The slug attempts to cross it, loses moisture faster than it can replace, and turns back or dies attempting the crossing. A ring of dry wood ash around a garden bed, reapplied after rain, creates a barrier that is as effective as most commercial slug deterrents and costs exactly what you paid for your firewood last winter. Which, if you burned wood for heat, like most people in this country did before the 1950s, was already in your possession. But the part they really did not want you to know comes next, because wood ash was only the beginning. The Amish method in Lancaster County circa 1923 was not a single trick. It was a layered system that addressed the slug's full life cycle, not just its nightly feeding pattern. Ash created the barrier, but the Amish also used copper, specifically thin strips of copper from old pipes or fittings laid at the edges of raised beds. When a slug contacts copper, a small electrical charge is generated through a reaction between the copper and the enzymes in the slug's mucus, causing a mild but deterrent sensation. This is not folk legend. The electrical deterrent effect of copper on slugs has been verified in university extension research, and it is the same principle behind the copper tape products that garden stores today charge $12 to $18 for a roll of. An Amish farmer in 1923 was using copper scrap he had saved from a plumbing repair. You are paying $18 for the same material in a branded roll with a picture of a garden on the front. And the third element, the one that closed the loop entirely, was the trap. Not a purchase trap. A ceramic bowl, a tin plate, or even a hollowed half of a gourd, sunk into the soil at the edge of the garden bed and filled with a shallow layer of a fermented grain liquid. In the 1920s in Lancaster County, that liquid was typically a small amount of fermented bran water, or in some cases, the runoff from fermenting grain mash that was a byproduct of farm brewing practices common in German-descended communities. Slugs are strongly attracted to the carbon dioxide and ethanol produced by fermentation. They enter the liquid, cannot escape, and drown. The trap is reset in the morning. The Amish farmer empties it, adds the slugs to the compost, refills it, and moves on with his day. The entire system ash barrier, copper deterrent, fermentation trap cost him nothing and required no trip to a store. What the Amish discovered about slugs is going to change how you see your garden forever, because it reveals something much larger than pest control. It reveals what happens to practical knowledge when money enters the equation. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to do it now. This channel exists for one reason: to recover the agricultural methods that communities like the Amish in Lancaster County, Holmes County, and LaGrange County have preserved for generations, while the rest of America was being convinced it needed to buy solutions to problems that already had free answers. We make a video like this every week. The industry buried these methods on purpose, and we dig them up one at a time. Subscribe, and do not miss the next one. Now let's talk about what actually happened to this knowledge, because this is where the history becomes uncomfortable for some very powerful people. By the mid-1950s, the American agricultural market had been fundamentally restructured. The Federal Extension Service, the USDA's network of county extension agents that reached into virtually every farming county in America, had shifted its educational mission. From roughly 1,950 onward, extension agents were increasingly trained on and incentivized to promote the adoption of synthetic inputs. Synthetic fertilizers, synthetic herbicides, and synthetic pesticides. This was not a secret conspiracy. It was documented policy, driven by an alignment of interests between the USDA, the newly formed petrochemical agriculture industry, and land-grant universities that were increasingly funded by industrial grants. Historian Deborah Fitzgerald documented this institutional alignment in her work on the industrialization of American farming. The extension agents were not lying. They believed what they had been trained to believe. But what they had been trained to believe was shaped by an industry that needed farmers to stop trusting free solutions and start buying manufactured ones. And here is where Earl Butz enters the story. Butz served as Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon and Ford from 1971 to 1976, and the policy framework he pushed was explicit. American agriculture needed to scale, specialize, and chemicalize. His famous instruction to American farmers, "Get big or get out," was not a casual remark. It was the philosophical summary of a federal agricultural policy that actively penalized small-scale, diversified farming and rewarded consolidation, monoculture, and total dependence on purchased inputs. Small kitchen gardens with their ash barriers and copper strips and fermentation traps were not part of the agricultural economy Butz was building. They were an embarrassment to it, a reminder that the system was not actually necessary. The Amish, meanwhile, were watching all of this from a very specific vantage point, outside of it. Because the old order Amish communities of Lancaster County, Holmes County, and LaGrange County did not electrify, did not mechanize beyond certain limits, and did not adopt synthetic inputs on the timeline that the rest of American agriculture did. This was not purely a religious decision, though religious identity was the frame. It was also a community decision about dependency. John Hostetler, the anthropologist and former Amish member who wrote the foundational academic study of Amish society, documented extensively how Amish bishops and community leaders evaluated each new technology, not on whether it worked, but on whether it would create dependency that weakened the community's self-sufficiency. By that measure, synthetic pesticides failed almost immediately. You cannot make them yourself. You must buy them. You must keep buying them. You become dependent on a supply chain, a price, a manufacturer. And the Amish did not do that. A farmer in Holmes County, Ohio, a man in his early 70s today, whose grandfather worked the same land his father had worked before him, still sets fermentation traps at the edge of his market garden beds every spring, exactly as his grandfather taught him. He uses ash from his wood stove. He lays copper strips salvaged from a barn repair along his raised bed borders. He has never purchased a commercial slug product. He does not need to. The slugs in his garden are not more polite than yours. His system simply removes the option of letting them get established. He told a researcher from Ohio State's Extension Outreach Program a few years ago, and this was noted in a community agricultural survey, that he could not understand why anyone would pay for what the earth and the fire had already provided for free. That comment deserves to sit for a moment, because it contains the entire argument. And now we arrive at the part of this story that closes the loop opened at the very beginning of this video, the question that has been sitting in the background since the first minute: why, in 2025, does a method that costs nothing, that has worked for over 100 years, that is still being used successfully in Amish gardens across 3 states, remain almost completely unknown to the average American gardener? The answer is not complicated. It is not hidden. It is just invisible when you are inside a system designed to make you a consumer. The method costs nothing, and you cannot build a market around something that costs nothing. You cannot advertise it. You cannot patent it. You cannot create a dependency on it. Wood ash is what is left after you heat your home. Copper is what old pipes are made of. Fermented grain water is what happens when grain sits in water, and time does what time does. None of these things have a barcode. None of them have a safety warning printed by a legal department. None of them generate quarterly revenue for a publicly traded company. And here is the moment everything changed, historically speaking. When the synthetic moluscicide market was built in the decades following World War II, it was not built to solve a problem that had no solution. It was built to replace a solution that was already working. Metaldehyde, the primary active ingredient in most commercial slug baits sold in American garden centers from the 1960s onward, was first developed in the 1930s and widely commercialized in the post-war era. It works. Nobody is saying it does not work. But it also accumulates in the soil, poses documented toxicity risks to pets, birds, and beneficial soil organisms, and it requires you to purchase it repeatedly, season after season, for as long as you garden. The Amish method requires you to save your ash. One is a system that serves you. The other is a system you serve. The historical record around metaldehyde's environmental profile is not flattering. UK environmental regulators moved to restrict outdoor metaldehyde use dramatically by 2022 due to water contamination concerns. American regulatory action has been slower, and the EPA's assessment process for pesticides like metaldehyde has historically been criticized for timelines that favor manufacturers, a pattern that legal scholars and environmental researchers have documented in the context of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act's implementation. This is not conspiratorial language. This is the documented gap between what is known scientifically and what is acted upon legally, a gap that has been the subject of serious peer-reviewed scholarship. Meanwhile, in a garden outside of Sugar Creek, Ohio, in the heart of Holmes County, the ash goes down, the copper strip goes in, and the fermentation trap fills with slugs by morning. No purchase necessary, no label to read, no residue in the soil, no call to make to a company that does not know your name and does not care about your garden. Just the same knowledge, applied the same way, that has kept Amish gardens productive since before the United States had a Department of Agriculture to tell anyone what to do. And this is what you need to sit with. The fact that a 73-year-old farmer in Holmes County has never needed to buy a Slug product is not a curiosity. It is evidence. It is evidence that the dependency was manufactured, that the need was engineered, that the system convinced your father, and possibly your grandfather, at some point along the road between 1950 and 1980, that the free answer was not a real answer, that real answers came in bottles with barcodes. And once that belief was installed, it became almost self-perpetuating. Because if you never try the ash barrier, you never know it works. And if you never know it works, you keep buying the bait. And if you keep buying the bait, the industry has no reason to tell you anything different. Think about your own grandfather for a moment. If he gardened, and if you are watching this channel, there is a very good chance he did. What did he use for pest problems? Did he talk about it? Did he have methods that seemed strange or old-fashioned, that nobody quite understood the logic of? Because the timing matters here. If your grandfather was gardening in the 1940s or early 1950s, before the full commercialization of the synthetic pesticide market, he may have been using methods that were closer to the Amish tradition than anything sold in a garden center today. And somewhere between his generation and yours, that knowledge was quietly made to seem obsolete. Not disproven, just made to seem unnecessary. That is the crime this video is about. Not a crime in a courtroom, a crime against continuity, against the quiet passing of knowledge from one hand to the next. That is how real agricultural wisdom survives. If this video has reached you, it means the algorithm did something right for once. Leave a comment below and tell us what your grandfather grew in his garden, or what method he used that nobody uses anymore, or what your family lost when the supermarket replaced the root cellar and the garden store replaced the ash bucket. We read every single one of those comments. They matter to this channel more than any metric does. And if you have a slug problem in your garden right now, if you walked out this morning and saw those silver trails on your raised beds, try the ash tonight. Dry ash, in a ring, around the beds that matter. It will cost you nothing. And in the morning, you will understand something that no amount of product advertising was ever designed to teach you. You will understand that you never needed them, that you already had everything, that the answer was always in the fire, in the copper, in the grain, and the water, and the time. If this video opened something for you today, give it a like. Share it with someone who still thinks the only real solutions come in bottles, because the Amish have been proving otherwise for 300 years. And they are still proving it right now, this morning, in Lancaster County, in Holmes County, in LaGrange County, in every quiet garden where the old knowledge was never allowed to die. The ash costs nothing, the copper costs nothing, the knowledge costs nothing. The only thing that cost you was the century you spent forgetting you already had it.